I mean, we will have time to continue our conversations after the talk. We have a wine and cheese reception, but right now I think we could turn to our speaker and then to our monthly lecture. First of all, good evening. I'm Ayşe Çağlar. I'm a permanent fellow at IWM, and I'm a professor at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology, University of Vienna. Welcome to our monthly lecture, where we have the honor and pleasure of having Manuela Boattcă for this evening's IWM lecture. Manuela is a sociologist, and since 2015, she has been a professor of sociology and head of social school of the Global Studies program at the University of Freiburg, Germany. She had held several visiting professor posts at the Institute of Social and Political Studies in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, at the Freie Universität Berlin, last at Södertörn University, Sweden in 2025, and it is not graved in stone, but almost. And in 2026-2027, Manuela will be the Theodor Heutz Professor of Sociology at the New School for Social Research in New York. Her work is anchored at the intersection of social sciences and cultural and literary studies, with a strong focus on the political economy of global inequalities, gender and citizenship, race and coloniality, and in terms of areas Caribbean and Europe, particularly unequal Europes, which we will be hearing about this evening more. Manuela Boattcă is not only a prolific writer, but she writes in several languages, in English, German, French, Spanish, Brazilian Portuguese, and Romanian. Her work has also been translated into Hungarian, Italian, Russian, and Swedish. She's the author and the co-author of several books. I'm not going to list all of them, but some of them, such as From Neo-Evolutionism to World Systems Analysis, Global Inequalities Beyond Occidentalism, which came out in 2016. There's one in Romanian, I think it is like the Laboratories of Modernity, and Europe and Latin America. This is what I try to figure out from the Romanian title. Decolonizing European Sociology, Transdisciplinary Approaches. And her 2022 co-authored book with Anca Parvulescu, Creolizing the Modern, Transylvania Across Empires, received the Barrington Moore Award and is translated into German and Romanian. At the IWM, she is working on a book project tentatively titled Racialization and Enslavement in Inter-Imperial Moldavias. We are all looking forward to your talk, Manuela, and the floor is yours. Thanks for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Ayşe, for the very kind introduction, and thank you to the IWM for having me here, for giving me the opportunity to work on this project. And not least, thanks everyone for showing up on this very significant evening that is significant outside of the framework of this lecture, given that it is the commemoration of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now, we did not pick the date on purpose for this lecture, but given that, as my title suggests, can we have the slide, please? As the title Unthinkable Europeans in Unequal Europes suggests, the topic is the label of Europe and how the notions of European, being European and Europeanness are connected to the theoretical and political implications of the label of Europe. And I want to suggest that the concept of Europe has never had a mere geographic referent, but has instead always reflected both the geopolitics of the various historical moments and the global power relations characterizing them. What does this have to do with the 24th of February? Well, it was, of course, 4 years ago today. We all know that Russia started its full-scale invasion following already 8 years of Russian war on Ukrainian territory since 2014. At the time of the full-scale invasion, many Western manifestations of support and solidarity operated with metaphors of geographical proximity and organic links between Europe and Ukraine. And when I say organic, I mean really organic, as in declaring Ukraine literally at the heart of Europe, and the war, therefore, as a European issue, which was very sudden, because that had not been the discourse, actually, ever. But then we started seeing sorts of proclamations in all sorts of European and other languages, Ukraine, guerre au cœur de l'Europe, an exhibition in the German parliament in November 22 declared and was titled, Kyiv is the unbreakable heart of Europe. Already in February 22, it was declared an invasion at the heart of democracy. And more recently, but actually ongoing, the consistent use of the metaphor of war at the heart of Europe was reiterated by Antonio Guterres, declaring the war a remaining and ongoing open wound at the heart of Europe. Now, as a scholar of critical discourse, it's always good to take a step back from these declarative kind of solidarities, and also remember that less than 20 years before the full-scale invasion, and still more than 20 years now, official discourse, but also official maps of the European Commission gave off a very different symbolism, one in which gradations of Europeanness were allocated according to the speed of a country's accession to the European Union. That means that countries that were not considered yet for accession to the EU were consistently told to Europeanize. Also, those that were bound to accede soon were called to Europeanize and viewed as lagging behind in the adoption of European standards and values. This was so explicit as to be color-coded in the European map of EU enlargement that the European Commission put out in 2004, shortly before the accession of 10 Eastern European countries to the EU. Basically, yellow were the member states already existing in 2004. Blue were the 10 new members that joined that year. Romania and Bulgaria, that had been denied access in the 2004 enlargement round, were represented in purple, as was Turkey, which had been a candidate to accession since forever, but actually 1986. Obviously, such a map is an obvious conflation of Europe with the European Union in terms of representation. What is it that is being represented here? It's a map of Europe, and who's not yellow on it is told to Europeanize. Not only were candidates and would-be candidate countries not considered European, but the EU monopoly on the label of Europe allowed for what has been called, especially by Dipesh Chakrabarty, an asymmetric ignorance of the geography and geopolitics of the European East. This seemed to shift after Russia's full-scale invasion, when Ukraine suddenly became the center of attention, but representations of the rest of the European East still betrayed this lack of basic knowledge of the other Europe, or one of the unequal Europes, if we want to put it like that. Borrowing the phrase asymmetric ignorance here from Chakrabarty in order to just anecdotically point to how brazen, actually, the lack of ignorance could be by outlets such as the BBC in July 2022, which put out a map of Europe and NATO countries in Europe, but Poland was all of a sudden not in NATO, and it was actually Belarus. What such a map also revealed, and one wonders, how do you get to a map that wrong? Can't you use an existing one? It actually has to do with wanting to get Ukraine right, and that's more or less the only thing that is right, and there's more like these. And you could say, well, okay, this doesn't have anything to do with Europe or Europeanness, because by that time, the UK itself was no longer in the EU. So this is not about the EU. This is about being ignorant of the geography of the European East. But you'd think they learned from it while they were still finding their feet in 2022, and then they learned what the neighbors of Ukraine are. They did not. Exactly 2 years later, July 2nd, 2024, they put up a map that shows the territories that Russia claims to control in Ukraine, and all of a sudden there are two Polands. I mean, can pick and choose. And of course, the commentary of the poster is, to be honest, I think a lot of people might be happy with the BBC's new map. Now, obviously, again, the location of Ukraine is correct. The rest of the European East is uncharted territory for a gaze that assumes a monopoly of knowledge, but also a monopoly of the label of Europe. And there are many more examples of such asymmetric ignorance. These are kind of particularly glaring. But my larger point here is that the dominant, the reigning notion of Europe and its claims to whiteness, civilization, modernity, development have historically been defined from positions of power, most of which were associated with imperial and colonial rule. Conflating the EU with Europe is only the latest iteration of this phenomenon. Historically, there are many more instances, and this is what I have called unequal Europes from about the 18th century, with the ascent to hegemonic status of France and later England, the rising colonial powers of the 18th century. Self-descriptions of Europe as kind of the producer of modernity's main revolutions, with the French Revolution as the main one, the English Revolution and the Industrial Revolution as defining for Europeanness and modernity, have kind of cemented what I've called the status of heroic Europe. This was not an objective description, this was a self-description and a claim, which at the same time relegated the other Europes to inferior status. On the one hand, the early colonial powers, particularly Spain and Portugal, were relegated to the status of a lesser, decadent Europe in the sense of declining from power, while large parts of the European East, which had lost out of colonial possessions overseas during that competitive age, became the epigonal Europe, from epigon, the one unworthy follower or the unworthy heir. The epigonal Europe perpetually trying to catch up, still perpetually trying to catch up, still told to Europeanize. Now, if we take this discourse to the present and try to make sense of how Ukraine fits in representations of Europeanness, how the East of Europe generally fits in representations of Europeanness, we stumble upon more instances not only of asymmetric ignorance, but of relegation to non-Europeanness or to residual categories of Europe. A few days ago, we had another commemoration, much less obvious or kind of prominent. The 20th of February marks the abolition of Romani enslavement on the territory of today's Romania in 1856. On that day in 2018, a joint article by Magda Matache and Cornel West pointed to the parallels between the enslavement of Africans in the Americas and Romani enslavement. And at the time, their article was an exception confirming the rule, with the rule being another form of asymmetric ignorance. On the one hand, the transatlantic trade in enslaved people, and especially the legacy of enslavement in the United States, have received a lot of scholarly and political attention. They are central to labor histories or global histories of coerced labor, at least. On the other hand, the migration of the Roma into Europe, their enslavement in Moldavia and Wallachia for over 500 years, and the consequences of this history of systematic exploitation, genocide, and disenfranchisement of a long-standing European population for understanding what it means to be European have until recently been left out of most analyses of European racism, slavery, and the Holocaust. In Romania, the 20th of February is being increasingly commemorated, increasingly regularly. This is from 2022. Europe's Forgotten Slaves, I think, is a particularly telling label. And last Friday, on the 20th of February, 170 years since the abolition were commemorated for the first time transnationally with an exhibition opened in Paris, to be followed by one in Bucharest on the topic of anti-Roma racism and its legacy. Now, forgetting and or dismissing such a significant aspect of European history as Romani enslavement is part of a larger process where the label of Europe always includes both Western Europe and its white and Christian populations, so the heroic Europe that I mentioned before, but rarely Europe's East and South, and even less its Southeast, as we know from scholars of European East, most clearly, most prominently Maria Todorova, but many others. So yes, as we know from scholars of Orientalism, Balkanism, racism, and critical whiteness, prevailing norms, whether they are Europe or the West or whiteness or settled societies or heterosexuality, feature as unmarked categories. We don't need to utter them. When we say we're here, we would know it's Europe. When we say we're in Austria, we don't need to mention, by the way, it's the West. When we self-describe, we rarely say, I am a white Romanian, a white German, a white Austrian. We should, but that is not necessary because it is the norm. The deviant categories that this norm dictates and rules of are those that are unnormative or non-normative, and that become the residual categories. It's a construction of difference that makes their normative character visible. The Orient, or as Stuart Hall put it, the rest, the West and the rest, is constructed as the non-West. Eastern Europe is the lesser Europe or the epigonal Europe, so that all deviant categories thus constructed require naming, while their unmarked counterparts remain unnamed, unqualified, or unstressed. Maria Todorova's example was always, if you want to make sure that you include Bulgaria in discussions of Europe, you need to say Eastern Europe, whereas you don't need to say Western Europe if you want to mention Germany or France. Similarly, for a long time, Black Europe needed to be argued, defended, and explained. It is only thanks to tremendous efforts by Black European activists and scholars that we have had kind of a flurry of publications, maybe in the past 20 years, making this a point, starting with a conceptual point. What does it mean to abstract Europe from this reigning notion that it's always about whiteness, Christianity, and Westernness, and to reinscribe the history of its African diaspora, of its Black and Muslim populations into both the history but also the self-conceptualization of Europe. And then after this one volume from 2004, Blackening Europe, we had Black Europe and the African Diaspora by Darlene Hein and Trika Keaton, together with Stephen Small. Then Afropean Notes from Black Europe, also published as a more kind of accessible publication, not just a scholarly, very abstract one, more also African Europeans, an untold history, and then more concrete iterations of how this refers to particular countries, especially glaring in the case of Germany, because it's also untranslatable. If you say Black Germany in English, it's one thing. If you say Schwarzes Deutschland, you have a problem, and you probably also refer to something else. So that leads to discussing the mobilization of Black Germany, in the book by Tiffany Florville, discussing the mobilization of Afro-German women, first as a point of even naming, even labeling Afro-Germanness as a category that belongs to Europe. And there's more on different countries, not as much. It looks like a lot, but it's basically kind of putting together what is out there. The Black Mediterranean, also more centered, like the title says, on Mediterranean, but especially Italy. This shows the need to do away with how Black European populations were rendered inconceivable in a history of Europe that was all white and Christian. Muslim Europeans were made invisible, and slavery in Europe became unmentionable, or to use the concept that I rely on in the title, a concept by Haitian anthropologist Michel-Rolph Trouillot, slavery became unthinkable. I'll come back to the term a bit later. What I'm interested in is how there is even a mobilization, as we see, with labels that until recently seemed to belong to the very same realm of being unspeakable, such as Black Europe, but we don't have the same for the Roma. The Roma, to this day, feature in this normative European imaginary as a particularly consequential other. And the question would be, what is it that makes them inconceivable or unthinkable? The first project to emancipate Europe's Roma population in order to turn them into useful citizens of empire was sketched out by Samuel Agustini Abhortis in the first ethnographic monograph on the Roma in Europe, Zigeuner in Ungarn, written in 1775. Agustini had put forth the hypothesis, later taken up by Indologists such as Johann Christian Rüdiger and Heinrich Krellmann, that on the basis of linguistic evidence, the origins of the Roma could be traced back to India. Linguists subsequently took up the link between India and Europe as a way of including the Roma in a European family. So you think, okay, we've been there before. This has been tried before. Now, as my co-author Anka Podvolescu and I have argued, insisting on the start of the Roma migration in India rather served to orientalize the Roma as a group. In his 1787 dissertation on the G word, Indologist Heinrich Krellmann described the Roma as having an unchanging essence anchored in race, which made them incompatible with Europeans. The dissertation appeared first in German and then was rather quickly translated in English. Krellmann wrote, "Let us reflect how different they are from Europeans. The one is white, the other black. This clothes himself, the other goes half naked. This shudders at the thought of eating carrion, the other regales on it as a dainty. Moreover, these people are famed and were even from their first appearance in Europe for being plunderers, thieves, and incendiaries. The European, in consequence, the European, not merely dislikes, but hates them." With this, Krellmann also exaggerated the number of Roma in different parts of Europe. He deployed colonial tropes of animality to describe hordes that rove and swarm the continent. In terms of religion, he considered them to be below heathens, a savage people. And the stark contrast between the racialization of Europeans as white, civilized, and of proper Christian faith, and the Roma as black, non-human-like, and non-believers within Europe closely mirrors the self-definition of European colonizers as white through dehumanizing enslaved Africans on plantations in the Americas. At the same time, the 500 years of enslavement of the Roma on the territory of today's Romania as property of the state, the local nobility, and the Orthodox Church, which could buy, sell, gift them as dowry, bequeath them to their next of kin, or exchanged them for debt, reinforced both the collective orientalization of the Roma and that of the European East as the West's other. So it was a very successful othering enterprise. The West increasingly defined itself in terms of humanistic ideals and a Christian penchant towards egalitarianism and social justice that mandated leniency towards the enslaved or even emancipation. Fears of the Ottoman expansion into Europe gradually put an end to the trade in enslaved people from the Black Sea and to domestic slavery in Western Europe more broadly. In turn, Moldavia and Wallachia, in which Roma slavery was legal until 1856, and which paid tribute to the Ottoman Empire up to the end of the 19th century, appeared as permanently less entitled, civilized, free, and ultimately less European, indeed as a despotic Orient. Here's a map to place ourselves and to place the provinces of today's Romania. You normally see these maps labeled historical provinces of Romania. That basically means that there was some kind of teleology that made it clear that there's nothing else they could become. But history can take many different paths. So these are historical provinces of today's Romania, but history could have played out differently. On this territory, slavery was practiced for more than 500 years, so longer than the enslavement of African Americans or of enslaved Africans in the Americas. It was part of a labor regime with an elaborate infrastructure, the beginnings of which may be traced back to the Mongol invasion of 2041-2042. It started as a practice of enslaving prisoners of war throughout the European East and initially applied to Tatars. So it wasn't either ethnicized nor racialized. After the settlement of large numbers of Roma people in the 14th and 15th centuries, following the creation of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, enslavement became a widespread phenomenon in these principalities and sometimes crossed into Transylvania, which which belonged to subsequent imperial powers, mostly integrated in Austria-Hungary or the Habsburg monarchy, and where enslavement was not legal. After and under the influence of the French Enlightenment, but also as a function of reforms in the Ottoman Empire, at the beginning of the 19th century, Moldova and Wallachia continued the project of collecting varieties of customary law, and they also proposed modernizing legislative initiatives in an effort to leave behind an Oriental past. This applied to the institution of slavery. There were three kinds of enslaved people, those belonging to the prince or the state, those belonging to monasteries, and those belonging to nobles or boyars. Under the modernizing legislative initiatives, the articles concerning the institution of slavery became kind of the nodes where the tension between customary law and modern law became most apparent. The existence of slavery was declared an old custom. The laws accepted it as an ancestral fact, and they were trying to improve the condition of the enslaved. So we have here a very clear borrowing from liberal discourse and a situation that reflects similar contradictions in the writings of West European Enlightenment thinkers who often condemned slavery philosophically, but when it came to the enslavement of Black Africans, they upheld it practically or even justified it. As in the Americas, also in the case of the enslavement of Roma people, the enslaved resisted slavery in a range of ways, primarily by escaping. But the discourse in the liberal circles, even among abolitionists, was one that actually underpinned the idea that this was all, emancipation was a way of leaving behind the Oriental past and becoming European. In a speech in 1891, politician and former owner of enslaved people, Mihail Cogălnicianu, who was in the meantime an abolitionist, said, "My contemporaries remember what G word, were, they remember what they were 50 years ago, just when the rays of modern civilization had tamed all morals in European societies, and when slavery had no abode except in Russia, and unfortunately also in Romania. So this kind of discourse was very present after abolition. So again, abolition 1856. He's now reminiscing and saying how bad it was before that. Also, right before abolition, a year before slavery ended, other Romanian abolitionists used news about the abolition of slavery in other non-Western regions, such as Egypt, to highlight how backward Romania's principalities were, even in comparison to former Ottoman possessions, and thereby themselves enlisted in Orientalism with a wish to Occidentalize. This kind of rhetoric is still kind of reproduced in newer works dealing especially with enslavement in the Black Sea region, that recount this idea of the disappearance of enslavement from the Black Sea region as something that was bound to happen and that actually marked the transition from the Middle Ages to modernity, when it is recounted, such as in this book's Slavery in the Black Sea Region, edited by Felicia Roșu. Slave owners around the 14th century emancipated Orthodox slaves because they were gradually becoming more and more humane towards the enslaved. So this happened in all Genoese settlements. These humanist ideas, but also the fear of Ottoman expansion, led to the end of slavery as practiced by Italians in Genoese settlements. And those families that had traded slaves from the Black Sea now exported enslaved people from Guinea to the Caribbean, which in a way meant slavery disappeared from Europe by, well, basically Europe's colonial expansion, and because of it. So also in this volume, Sandra Origone recounts it as Eastern domestic slavery disappeared, a new unfreedom began for new slaves in new regions. So basically this feudal form of enslavement in the east of Europe, but also in the south, disappeared from Europe, but then was completely transformed into chattel enslavement in the Americas. And part of it is an understanding that there was a fluidity of roles in this kind of medieval enslavement. You could be an enslaver today, but you could become captured the next day, depending on who won the battle. So it wasn't ethnicized, it wasn't racialized, it was a matter of capturing prisoners of war. Whereas this changes completely with the chattel slavery and racialized enslavement in the Americas. What the authors kind of point out is that, well, there was a bit of an exception. The only exception from this regional norm was G-word slavery in Moldavia and Wallachia, which shared several characteristics with North American slavery, such as the stability and self-reproduction of the slave population, and the near equivalence of a certain ethnic origin with a slave status. Now, in order to speak of an exception, you'd have to either have a phenomenon that is localized or that is short-lived, or both. How localized was it? We saw it spanned two provinces and several institutions, having three types of enslavers. How short-lived it was? If we start looking at a few selected dates, on Romani enslavement before 1492, we have at least the approximate date of 1300 as the Romani Aresagipe, the arrival of Roma in Europe, where Romani groups begin to be enslaved in Southeast Europe. The first recorded transaction of enslaved Roma in the territory of today's Romania is also from the 14th century, where also Mircea the Great of Wallachia indicates that Roma have been in the country for over 100 years, so we can think about even 1300 as being a rather late documentation. 1416, already Roma are expelled from the Meissen region of Germany. In 1445, Prince Vlad Dracul of Wallachia transports some 12,000 persons who looked like Egyptians, hence the etymological confusion, from Bulgaria for enslaved labor. 1471, the first anti-G laws are passed in Lucerne, and 17,000 Roma transported into Moldavia by Stephen the Great for enslaved labor. Stephen the Great was later canonized by the Orthodox Church as a saint. 1492 and 1496, in order to kind of catch the symbolic nexus here, King Vladislav of Slovakia issues safe conduct orders for traveling Roma. And in 1492, the first anti-G word laws are passed in Spain, the Iberian Peninsula. So we see there a moment where the Europe's colonial expansion is very much linked to a form of racialization and exclusion of particularly non-white and considered non-European people that was not as systematic before and that is becoming codified more and more. Because I wanted to also bring a local flavor to this, in 1496-98, the imperial diet in Landau in Freiburg, where my university is, but that was part of Austria at the time, declares Roma traitors to the Christian countries, spies in the pay of the Turks, and carriers of the plague, a trope that we've seen again and again, especially during the pandemic. The carriers of the plague is kind of a go-to stereotype that can be activated upon, well, 1498, 4 Roma people accompany Christopher Columbus on his third voyage to the Americas, yes, as enslaved people. Why is it important that Romani enslavement has such a long history before 1492? First, because the literature on Europe's Atlantic expansion, including decolonial literature, tends to downplay inner European hierarchies after 1492 and focus instead on the transatlantic trade and the colonization of the Americas as the main bone of contention between European powers, including between those that did not acquire American colonies. So mostly we get, when we talk about enslavement, a map that looks west from Europe with kind of few arrows leading from Africa to Europe in terms of where domestic slaves were being transported. But other than that, kind of concentrated on how the trade and enslaved people from Africa to the Americas was basically leaving Europe as framework of slavery outside of the interest. Now, while the European enslavement trade behind the plantation economies of the Americas was considered central to the spread of colonialism, but also coloniality in the decolonial parlance, the enslavement of Romani people on the very territory of Europe, both during and after the transatlantic trade, was never addressed. So this is where I think it becomes useful and maybe productive to engage with the concept of unthinkable history as proposed by Michel-Rolph Trouillot. So Trouillot used it in order to explain the way the Haitian Revolution, the first successful revolution of enslaved people in the Americas in what was then France's richest colony of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, was kind of not present in Western historiography of the Age of Revolutions. And when it was kind of downplayed as a mere rebellion or, and worse, as an echo of the French Revolution. But more interesting than this kind of ignorance or downplayment of the Haitian Revolution and its momentous effects on all of the Americas and Europe as well, was the reason that Trouillot makes out for how this operated, because he said the Haitian Revolution entered history with a peculiar characteristic of being unthinkable even as it happened, because what was happening was history was being read through ready-made categories, so basically the unmarked categories that are the norm. And in this set of normative categories, it wasn't an option to have Black people as political subjects who can reflect, organize, and carry out a successful revolution. The very idea of Black subjects was philosophically kind of inconceivable, but have political subjects carry out a revolution was even more kind of against the grain. So basically, the trivialization of the revolution or the silencing was part of also how this entire silencing and belittling made the Haitian Revolution unthinkable, not only even as it happened, but also before. In the current European context, the notion of the unthinkable strikingly parallels the erasure and active forgetting of the Roma in the conceptualization of Europeanness and of their opposition to and mobilization against enslavement in the historiography of European resistance. Similar to French and British narrative of the abolition of slavery as the achievement of humanist ideals by European Enlightenment elites, the Romanian abolitionist discourse emphasized the need to modernize the country and Europeanize. Neither discourse centered or even included Roma agency and Roma voices. This is where I propose the concept of Romani Europeans, not so much as a scholarly concept yet, but more as a way to signal a political necessity and a way of signaling a conceptual need to refer to a population as European that has been European for hundreds of years. And I understand this category of Romani Europeans as a European population commonly defined out of both Europeanness and whiteness, and to whom migration or nomadism is ascribed by default, rather than settledness, if you remember the marked versus unmarked categories. Several years ago, Alyosha Tudor has coined the term migratism for the systematic assumption that certain individuals or groups have recently migrated, whether or not they actually did. And this is what we know when we hear the infamous question, well, where are you from? For Tudor, migratism becomes a form of racism when directed at those racialized as non-white, though it is not restricted to them. And as we saw, while the Roma have migrated from India to Europe 800 years ago or longer, that time, that several generations and several centuries do not warrant their acknowledgement as Romani Europeans today, as we have Afro-Europeans, Black Europeans, Muslim Europeans. Indeed, that very designation is unthinkable. With a different question in mind, this condition was addressed by literary scholar Laura Doyle in order to point to the Eurocentrism of seeing imperial and colonial rule only as a matter of Western European control. She talked about inter-imperiality in the context of us continuing to make what she calls the oddly Eurocentric assumption that Western European imperialism accounts for all recent imperialism, with the concomitant misperception that all territory is either a European post-colony or uncolonized. So if we take into account the history of not only Eastern, but other European regions at the crossroads of several empires that were not involved in the Atlantic colonial expansion, this is something that competes with colonialism, competes with coloniality after the end of colonialism, but also precedes European colonialism in the Americas. So taking that into account shows, as Anca Purvulescu and I have tried to discuss with respect to Transylvania, that coloniality is only a late moment in a larger inter-imperial configuration of power that predated the emergence of the Western Atlantic expansion. We did this in the book that was already mentioned, meaning that inter-imperiality precedes coloniality and coexists with it while outlasting imperialism. Conceptually, this shift in attention from westwards, only Europe's colonial expansion after 1492, to both before 1492 and within Europe after 1492, renders various parts of Europe thinkable as modern inter-imperial spaces, and also opens up a conversation about European others in which Romani Europeans also become thinkable. I'm slowly coming to an end. I have to tell you how it ended. I did, but maybe you're still wondering. Romania was founded in 1859 through the Union of Moldavia and Wallachia. 3 years after slavery was abolished, the Romanian state very much still remained a racial state. There was segregation. There was also the emancipation of the enslaved took place very much, like in the case of the Americas, by compensating the enslavers, not the formerly enslaved. While the rhetoric was one of forgiveness, so the enslaved were forgiven what they owed their masters. There's, to this day, little commemoralization in public memory. To this day, no apology from the Orthodox Church. Who did apologize was the Pope, the previous Pope, for discrimination and not segregation. He said discrimination and historical mistreatment. When he visited Bucharest in 2019, yeah, he said segregation as well, which gained him a lot of attention and quite a bit of enthusiasm, including by Romani activists in Romania, but also the criticism by those who said, he didn't say he apologizes for slavery. He didn't mention that Roma were victims of the Holocaust. If you utter an apology, if you take the opportunity to do that, why don't you use the exposure that your position gives you in order to even mention such phenomena to many people who would have first found out about it through your voice? So Romani scholar Ioanida Costache wrote this critique of the Pope's apology in very similar ways before I knew that I would be working on this with the Unthinkable, saying, what makes Roma suffering so unspeakable, so unsayable, that the Pope couldn't name the Holocaust or Roma slavery? And her point is, we shouldn't have to fill in the blanks. The blanks are the unthinkability to this day, while former personalities such as Prince Wallachian ruler Constantin Brâncoveanu is still commemorized. He has been canonized also by the Romanian Orthodox Church for having resisted conversion to the Islamic faith and for being executed by the Ottomans together with his 4 sons. But in museums today, we see in his family history also the fact that he bequeathed 30 souls of G-word to all of his 8 daughters, and this is presented as a list, as a dowry list, without any comment. Is Romani European history unthinkable? Hopefully not. Our Romani colleagues are doing incredible work with the archival materials that are still, well, those of the Orthodox Church are not accessible, but there's still a lot out there. And I invite you to look up the Roma Slavery and Places of Memory album of social history that is open access in Romanian and English, and is just a sample of documents that are out there that people could and should maybe consult. And one of the authors, Nicu Furtuna and Anca Părvulescu and I, try to think about the archive that this, both metaphorically and materially, that this history presents and makes available to us. In terms of bringing it down, this is my last point, to the fact that we are thinking about a larger investment in the label of Europe and Europeanness, but we do so today in this lecture. There were very pointed and, well, rather exceptional heroizations of Romani people in the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. There was this very mediatized event that we don't know whether or not it actually occurred, of Roma from Kherson capturing a Russian tank and dismantling it for parts. This was a play on a lot of stereotypes, but it also measurably improved the perception of Roma people within Ukraine itself. While we also saw that those long marginalized Roma people from Ukraine have actually faced further exclusion, both in the West and in other Eastern European countries that they were forced to also flee to. but there's also hope, as my colleagues from Poland have recently very lovingly put together the solidarity of the Polish Roma with Ukrainian Roma after the Ukrainian Roma have been facing terrible exclusion while fleeing into Poland. I want to end on this hopeful note, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Manuela, for this wonderful talk, and very rich, actually, and explosive. I would say this is how I see it, actually, and focusing on the racialization of the European interior is definitely very important, I think, because most of the race and racialization, seeing race and racialization through the longer history of Europe's colonial overseas projects, colonial dispossession, settler colonialism, is important, but bringing it to the interior, the European interior, is, I think, very, very important. And I see it as this kind of an approach providing a strong, but in my opinion, quite an overdue intervention to a post-colonial lens. I know that that might be contestable, but that orients itself, I think, around the binaries between the West and the rest, the global North and the global South, which I think runs the risk of obfuscation, the history of Europe's many Souths and Easts, and it curtails the internal asymmetries, and to use Adnan Verdi's rightly, as he puts it, there was always an East within the West and a South within the North, and I think that this kind of the post-colonial take, in a way, flattens it, and then you complicate this picture in a very powerful way. In a way, you're bringing racial capitalism at home. You're bringing talking about racial capitalism at home by mapping the systematic exclusion of Roma from the making of Europe, its history, memory, and subjecthood. And I think this I find it very important, and an underlying that slavery as a European institution within. Of course, we are all recognizing and talking about the overseas and then the colonies. I have three small questions, and just to start the discussion, and then we will open the floor to the discussion. And my first question is about the location of Romani Europeans, to use also James' designation in Black Jacobins, in but not of Europe. And such a position has been and is shared by many different groups that you referred towards the end to, just to name few: Muslims and Jews, and then sometimes that the migrants, depending on how you define and who those migrants are. And they have been brought into the picture of those epistemic hierarchies. I wonder, in comparison to other racializations, do you see something specific to Roma, which you brought up, that in relation to enslavement? But other than that, I mean, and why that enslavement actually becomes so specific? And so, do you see anything specific about this kind of knowledge production, and if it is the enslavement, why, how that enslavement was codified, we know, we heard about it, but whether this is transferable really to the other in but not of Europe. That is one question. I will put the three, you pick whatever you want, and then we can talk about the other. The other one is, I would like to hear more about the consequences of such a perspective for area studies, in particularly with the engagement with Eastern Europe as area studies beyond the geopolitics of knowledge production. And your comments, and I mean, I know from your also other work that the language, the Romani language and literature being not seen as world literature, but as folklore. And we know that this is a lot, I mean, this has something to do with a lot with this kind of folklorization and with the area studies. So what is there is more hidden, I think, in your intervention in terms of the geopolitics of knowledge production, and this Ukraine examples were very, very good. They became the heart of Europe suddenly, and they, I mean, if you come suddenly, you might leave very suddenly too. So yes, hopefully not. But and the last question is about what to do in terms of research, how to make these histories legible. That you referred at the end with the kind of the archives and then the kind of the work that I assume that it's a collective in a way, and how to go beyond what is referred as colonial aphasia, that is about a systemic unknowing, that you were talking about it. And you hint at an alternative way in relation to Roma. But more, I'm asking about, in general, about epistemologies of knowing, of that kind of unknowing, how to interrupt that. I mean, these are the three questions that I mean, your talk really triggered, and I think that they are very explosive in that sense, that, I mean, these are major interventions. So you could choose whichever you want, if you want 1, 2, 3, or just one, and then then we could open it. But thanks a lot for this very thoughtful and very interesting talk.
Thank you so much. These are also very rich questions, and they could warrant a long answer as well. But I think they may be possible to answer briefly. The first question, the in but not of Europe and how that relates to other forms of racialization, I think the closest comparison that we can make is with Muslim Europeans, and that indeed the point that differentiates them is having been subjects to enslavement. And enslavement here is important to differentiate within enslavements, because of course Muslims have been enslaved as well, but what we don't see being talked about so much is that Romani enslavement was chattel slavery. They were being sold and given as debt and given as dowry. So they were dehumanized in the same way that the trafficked Africans were dehumanized in the Americas. That is not the case for most other forms of enslavement, although they are atrocious. The other comparison being made is, and a lot of the times it's used to relativize enslavement, is, well, but there was serfdom in Romania as well, and this was horrible, and the slavery was not much worse. It was much worse if your children were born into slavery also, which was neither the case for other enslaved people who were prisoners of war, who could redeem themselves, who in, I don't know, the Ottoman Empire, you could become anything but sultan. We've discussed this before around with the fellows here. But there was no social mobility within Romani enslavement. as to the Jews, there's a shift happening there that is very important, where after the Holocaust, discursively, Jews are incorporated into a joint European history. That was not the case before. So the idea of a Jewish Christian civilization is a very new term that only became possible because of atonement or wanting to or proclaiming a will to atone for the Holocaust. For most of the history, European Jews were very much the other and very much racialized and not considered at all compatible with becoming Europeans, but the Holocaust, at least discursively, kind of covered that for a while. And we don't have that shift happening with any others, even though many of these others were also victims of the Holocaust, but not as recognized. So the Roma were victims and the Muslims were victims as well. So in a way, the answer is I do think that this is kind of a singular history. And that is why it is important to point it out. The question of the consequences for area studies, I think, I hope I have a short answer to that, that it does explode area studies in a way that relates the east of Europe to many other regions because they were connected, because migration and enslavement connected regions in a way that had to do with how capitalism connected regions. And what was being circulated in terms of the products of slavery, both Romani enslavement and enslavement in the Caribbean, were products for a world market. They were not local products. And this is what connects regions. So what that tells us, I hope, is that we cannot find out about the consequences or how to go on from the situation if we just stay within the kind of container of area studies, as productive as it is to also engage with something more concentrated, but most of it is related. What to do next? I think in terms of unlearning, and that would be kind of my first answer, unlearning the received categories of what it means to be European, what it means to be modern or developed. This is why Anca Purvulescu and I chose the title Creolizing the Modern, kind of provocatively including something in the modern that was not supposed to be there, and it was not supposed to be European or white. Creolizing, well, why? No, the modern is ours, is actually to be kept pristine. Nothing is pristine, and we need to unlearn those certainties that we can retreat into safe Westernness, safe Europeanness, and safe Christianity to embody some kind of centrality in telling histories, which had been the case for most of the history of the social sciences and for historiography as well. The kind of historiography that Trouillot addresses when he says, well, he thought that Black subjects are not political subjects, period. And you can't think beyond that, which turns a very consequential revolution unthinkable because it wasn't in your 4x4 table, so it falls out of history. Well, unlearning that is a way of decolonizing yourself. I know not everyone likes this this terminology, but it is a way of understanding. Okay, maybe leaving the abstract part and giving an example. I was born to think of myself as European, and I was raised in the middle of Bucharest to a white middle-class family, not having to think about whether or not I was white. Because discussing whether or not you were white in Romania was not a category to be employed in the very part of Romania in which slavery had been so important. And migrating into Germany around the time of the Eastern enlargement that I talked about, I realized that all of a sudden this narrowing down of what it means to be European, to being a citizen of a European Union country, kind of made me not European yet. And I was was very puzzled because I was not taught to not think of myself as European. And hearing that we have to Europeanize was very infuriating because I thought we are European. Look, we have been so European as to stop the Ottoman invasion from, right? So I was also socialized with these discourses and unlearning all of that in order to understand how you can contribute to writing these stories differently and telling your own story differently so that it doesn't reproduce these pernicious tropes is a first step. It's not the way to go. It's like maybe the first baby step, but a necessary one.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I think that this pathway that you showed is so many people went through that, especially coming from on the peripheries, on the fringes, and that the shock that they have, that how they have been referred, and the discrepancies, the dissonances. But I like it very much. This kind of the unlearning the categories as an antidote to unknowing. That is that you that you brought. That is, I think it's very interesting. But let's open the floor to the questions, and please come up with your questions. First you, then. Okay, but I think she was first.
Mulțumim foarte mult pentru prezentare.
Cu drag.
So my question is related to the archival work that you did, because I'm also working on the archives on Roma slavery in Romania.
Hey.
And I was very much trying to explain to people who are not Romanian how difficult it is to work with the archives. And I feel like your term of unthinkable sums up the whole difficulty of working on the Roma slavery in the archives, because it was so unthinkable. Roma people were so unthinkable that they're not even part of the archives, from my knowledge of them. And I was just very curious of how was your research in the archives, and on which archival information, which sources did you? Yeah, that was it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Are we collecting or?
Maybe let's collect 2, 3, and then give the floor to you.
Okay, in that case, I'm here. Thanks very much for the talk and the discussion, and I'm really appreciate the intervention. I'm particularly very sympathetic to the theoretical conversation you're staging between scholars of the Caribbean and Europe. But I actually wanted to ask also a bit more historically and follow up on the discussion of the Ottoman case that you were talking about. So on the I guess. A question that came to my mind, the principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia were part of the Ottoman Empire, hundreds of years, and there, or to put it this, yeah, I know, but to put it under the Phanariots, for example, at least their story should be told as part of an Ottoman history. So the question naturally rose to me, to what extent the history of the slavery of Roma in these principalities should or could be told alongside the Ottoman story. So then you partly answered that question, preempting it by saying, oh, the Ottoman slavery system was, very different in terms of the opportunities for mobility. But I was just wondering if you could put some more flesh to that, especially because you had also had a few references. I haven't read that book that you were referring to, but that said that the Ottoman expansion changed the dynamics of the Black Sea slave trade. So I was wondering if you could put that, generally in the context of Ottoman history, and I guess, is it just Eastern Europe, or is it also the Northern Ottoman Empire? Like, how can thinking more thickly with the Ottoman history also help us understand Roma slavery differently?
Okay, and your questions, please.
Yeah, thank you for the fascinating talk. And I'm thinking of plantation slavery in the U.S. in Americas, how it's important for the formation of capitalism. How important was the enslavement of Roma to the economic system existing there?
Wow, I get the great questions. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yes, the archival situation is dire. to the extent that you don't have the category, right? That's the unthinkability of it. So you have to actually guess where those materials could be. Are they under dowry list? Are they under sales contracts? Are they under something else? While the Orthodox church archives are not accessible, but maybe you've had more luck. So my my work so far has relied on the documents that our colleagues at the ERIAC made available, and also those who are already working on archives, and that they put either online. A lot of it is digital. I mean, not a lot of it. A lot of it that we know of is digitized. So I've done more work on kind of the Roma texts published that were incorporated in different publications and how they were seen. Ayşe mentioned the fact that when they were discussed at all and when they were published, and that was the exception, they were not considered to have a potential of world literature. So I was trying to bypass the lack of access by going to these sources where the idea of authorship and of subjectship is already under question, because a lot of the times, in order to folklorize a text, you have to either say, well, it's probably a Romani author, but we don't have the name. So it's anonymous, which is the best legitimation for not having it be literature at all. But we should talk. Yes, Ottoman history. Look, yes, very important point. The principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia paid tribute to the Ottoman Empire, so they were not occupied in that sense. And the enslaver, the Romanian state as an enslaver, was the Romanian state. And the Orthodox Church was the biggest enslaver. So while that is linked to the Ottoman Empire, it wasn't Ottoman slavery. It was a very different institution. And the nobility, you could say, okay, maybe they were the most overlapping category, because they were kind of the Phanariot princes were appointed by the Ottoman Empire. So that is, who is the state? Is the prince the state? Is the, who represents what authority, if you want? But it was not the Ottoman Empire that decided upon how this particular institution functioned. It was very much a matter of kind of at the discretion, if you want, of individual boyars, individual nobles, the state, and the Orthodox Church that we know least about. Was it just, or how about the Ottoman Empire outside of the East of Europe? That's the big question, of course, because the entire rhetoric of the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe relies on how the Ottoman Empire was doing within Europe. But in the north of Africa, it was very much active well into the period where it was considered the sick man of Europe. So having that, or wielding that much power in the north of Africa, tells a very different story. Mustafa Minavi has written a lot about it, and it makes it, it just kind of upends the history that we have. This is actually part of the book project that I'm working on here, because Anca Burvulescu and I only wrote on enslaved Romani people in Transylvania, on our book in Transylvania, because they play a role in the text that we're looking at, and we didn't want to reproduce the silence of these texts. And somehow, because of the big need to have these conversations, we got a lot of feedback on that, and we thought, well, actually, we should be writing about the parts of Romania where slavery was an actual long-term institution. In Transylvania, there were just echoes of that. So this is the project on racialization and enslavement into imperial Moldavias. And it's just beginning, but yes, integrating the history of the Ottoman Empire would be a crucial part of it. The fact that we don't know much about the contribution that enslavement had in terms of the political economy, in terms of capital, is that we don't have access to the Orthodox Church's archive. We know, we can infer from very kind of piecemeal and fragmented pieces of information, but one kind of prominent one that my colleagues Magda Matake especially talk about, is if you take a tour of the monasteries in Moldavia, people point out the beautiful architecture and the surprising coloring of a blue in Voronezh that was never before used or ever after reproduced. Who was doing the labor is not mentioned, and it was always Roma people. That is patrimony. It's not just accumulating wealth. It's the national patrimony that is very closely linked to that. There are no numbers that I know of kind of the economic contribution of enslavement to the Romanian state, and that is a huge gap to be filled. So yeah, it's again open question.
And the second round of questions, Michael, I see you, and I don't see at the end. Yes, okay. Yes, sorry. Oh, okay. I see.
Thank you for that fascinating talk. I just one of the organising concepts was Europeanness, and the sort of placing of various other people within that, so the Roma in this case. And I just wondered, if you think of, I suppose, from a lot of the time you've been talking about and of course you started with this lovely example of modern Europeanness in Ukraine. A lot of the time, surely what was really of interest to people was Christianity, was Christendom. And then after that, so from the 13th through to maybe the 18th century, and then it must have been something like civilization, or probably civilization is simple. Is what unites us. And I wonder and then sometime in the 20th century, people began to think about Europeanness as distinct from Americanness. And then after 45, with the rise of the EU, which was where you started, the Europeanness takes on this completely new. So I was just wondering, if you think about Europeanness, as it were, in that metaphorical Europeanness, in those phases, do you think the way people thought about populations like Roma changed over that time? Through Christianity, civilization, cultural and then political Europeanness.
Thank you.
And here the question, yes.
Vă mulțumesc mult pentru prezentație foarte interesantă. I wanted to ask you, so you have the question of a confession arising several times, and I believe that it's something important to point out that you've started with the Tatars and the question of enslavement and whatnot, and pointing out that it was not racialized, but it was heavily confessionalized, right? In a way. And so, for example, a Muslim was not allowed within the Ottoman Empire to be enslaved. So I would point out, and tied to this, I have a question. While Roma people were enslaved, while they belonged to the monasteries, what sort of interaction was there with the Christianity, with the Orthodox Christianity? Were they belonged to it, or were they not really? Was it used as a source of control, the way how it was in the chattel slavery in the Americas, or was it not used? Thank you.
Yeah. And I think there was Angela that I can hardly see here. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for the very, very inspiring and really illuminating lecture. Maybe one point what I would like to bring that, as you mentioned as well, that Roma really played an important role, particularly scholars, activists who really mined so many materials and works. And I'm just wondering actually that the new book, which was published by Magda Matake, so it's very much about slavery as well. How do you relate to that, and how your framework is different? And so it would be really great to hear that. And also I'm thinking about, I'm going to be a little bit critical that you are quoting several scholars and thinking about that, how Roma appeared in your lectures. So mainly, on articles as an activist and scholars, Ioannida, sure, but as a anyway, article. Sorry, I mean, I hate to take this role, but I'm just thinking about, like, you know, the lecture is about asymmetrical ignorance, right? And how about the asymmetrical knowledge production? And how can you think about the asymmetrical, you know, theorization? And how can we involve those guys who already did this incredible work, right? What you are using as well. Thank you.
Thanks.
you.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe I'll start with that because it's obviously otherwise the elephant in the room. Magda's book, Magda Matake's book, The Permanence of Anti-Roma Racism, was launched last Friday on the anniversary or the commemoration of the 170 years. So I haven't read it. I know of it, and I thought of you know, just showing the cover, but then I was fearing that I would get a question about what's inside, and I don't know enough about it. I just heard the book launch. There's a couple of others. There's a lot coming out these days, really, the past years. There's special issues of critical Romani studies. I do think that it's very important to point out the album of social history by Nicu Furtuna and Claudiu Turcitu, and that was up. But yes, it could be kind of, it's always possible to include more. I don't think that I am kind of taking something away from Romani scholars if I am insisting on their contribution without showing every single one or many more of them. But that's all I can say before just saying, you know, I wasn't trying to kind of hide anyone. But yes, there's always more contributions to be discussed. Then let me go to your question, the confession. How was religion basically important? We don't have the same kind of equivalence of the importance of conversion for slaves as we do in the case of the Americas. What we do have is the conversion by the kind of out of free will, basically voluntary conversion of Roma people, whether or not they were enslaved. You have conversions to Christianity in the Habsburg Empire as well. You have like also in the Habsburg monarchy of Romani people because they were told to settle and they were considered new Christians. That is, again, speaking also to Ayşe's question about area studies. That is very interesting because it's the same label that was used to discuss kind of converted Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula. They were all new Christians. It sounds good, but it's not good because it actually makes you, it exposes you to, well, in that case, the Inquisition. So it tells you you're not to be trusted. Some states, Muslim Roma in Romania as well, there's a minority. There's more, of course, the Crimean Tatars are their own also kind of group to be considered here. So there's a variation. Religion was not kind of a deal breaker, if you want. But what we do have is documents pointing to intermarriage, where that was very significant. There are few documents that point to when free Christian men, Romanian men, married enslaved women, they became enslaved themselves. So that question, Christianity didn't save you and whiteness didn't save you. It was kind of, if you pick to be basically married to an enslaved person, then that's it. We know that from other contexts that were very much colonial. We know that from Germany's colonies in Africa, that having offspring with an enslaved person was very much discouraged. So if you chose to not only get married, but also recognize your offspring as your own, you would lose German citizenship. This is something that Fatima El-Tayeb discusses. And the fact that, this was tied, again, to maybe the question of capitalism. The idea was to keep people from having property who were not white. And that maybe brings me finally to Michael's question. Did perceptions of who is European change in time? Of course they did, precisely because Europeans did not think of themselves as Europeans in the 15th century, right? They did not think of themselves as Western, and they did not think in terms of nationalities. But we saw that quote from Grellman. He was writing at the end of the 18th century, and he's saying the European hates the Roma, right? That's already quite specific, and it's actually pretty, well, maybe visionary in a bad way, but he does use this category. Here I'm very much with the decolonial scholarship that speaks about how there was a need for a self-understanding of the Occident to emerge before there was a basis for Orientalism, right? I mean, Stuart Hall also says that when he discusses the West and the rest, but Fernando Coronil, Venezuelan anthropologist, discusses that more concretely when he says, well, yeah, Said was right. Orientalism is very important, but Orientalism did not come out of thin air. Napoleon didn't come up with an idea to Orientalize Egypt. What we needed was 200 centuries of kind of digesting the fact that we discovered a continent that we didn't know was there in order to start relating to it in a way that lets a collective identity as Europeans emerge. Because the colonizers did not refer to themselves as European. They were the conquistadors, they were the Catholics, they were subjects to this prince or the other. But the colonial enterprise had a need for unifying under an identity which was first religious, which was Catholic versus non-believer, that was worse, but not having a soul, which was what was ruled to be the case for enslaved Africans, was kind of absolving the Christian enslavers from having enslaved people die under their watch, because then it meant that it wasn't a sin if that weren't people in the first place. So it takes 200 years for obviously ballpark figure, for an identity as Western and European to emerge. And that is also shifting once it emerges, right? Where is Europe and who is considered European? This is why I said the European Union discourse is only the latest iteration of this entire phenomenon, which is self-serving. It's as we saw when it looks like solidarity, Ukraine is in the heart of Europe. When we don't need it, then we can forget about it, and we actually don't know what its neighbors are, let alone anything else. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are running out of time, or we are exactly on time. Thank you very much for your questions, but thank you very much, Manuela, for this fascinating talk. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And please join us for wine and cheese reception downstairs, and we could continue our conversations there. Thanks a lot. It was a wonderful talk.
Thank you so much.
That was very good, very good.
Oh, that was my goal for you to first like it.